time limit. Pastor Mark has given you all you need to know about me. The only thing I'd add there is that this Jewish adult education is a second career for me. I was a U.S. civil servant, retired quite a while ago, and I retired because work was getting in the way of my Jewish studies. Let me make a couple of things very clear. I'm not a historian. My early work was in political science, which is quite different from history in a lot of ways. I appreciate the interplay between history and ideas, and I am not a rabbi. Being a pastor is too much like work. Let me also make a kind of a disclaimer. My talk and my answers might be mildly controversial within some Jewish environments. I'm not going to be radical in any way, but for many people that I'll call traditionally observant, the hand and the plan of God are the essential issues in Jewish history, practice, how Jews have come to the United States, all of which I'm going to talk about. But I'm not going to talk about the more theological aspects. For some academics, my simplifications would be just totally intolerable. For some postmoderns, my failure to use critical theory to frame my story would make it totally irrelevant. I tend to more of a traditional way of looking at things. And putting this into 45 minutes, as indicated, is something of a challenge. In fact, it's going to be a lot less than that. I'm really going to talk, well, I can talk for as long as I need to talk, but I will try to limit it to maybe 20, 25 minutes, going over a lot of points quickly. But if you have questions, especially questions for clarification, let me urge you to raise your hands as we go along. If you're anything like me, you may forget the question by the end of the time. So and the other thing, much more important, is that if you've got a question, if I've been too simplistic or I forgot to define something, if you've got a question about it, I guarantee you there's a dozen people in the room who also have questions, so it would be worth it for everybody. So questions are acceptable. I understand my own time constraints, and I'm perfectly comfortable saying, I don't think we have time for that. So, I'll spend a few minutes on Jewish history. Now, why would I spend time on Jewish history and then talk about the Jewish faith? The reason is that to understand Jewish history, to understand Judaism, the Jewish people, Jewish practice, Jewish beliefs, one has to consider the history, because Judaism is a little different from other religions, especially in the United States, but around the world, in that it is the religion of the Jewish people. The Jewish people's religion is Judaism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a religion. I'm not minimizing religion, but for many Christians, for many Muslims, the religion is what you take on, is what you're born with, you choose to accept as a young adult, an adult. Judaism is a little bit different. If you are born a Jew, you're a Jew, and the religion is your religion. So talking about the ethnicity is important. In particular, a couple of points of Jewish history, and one minor thing. For about 2 or 3 generations in the United States in particular, but in some parts of Europe, there was a movement within the Jewish world to minimize the ethnicity part. To say, we're just Americans who practice the religion of Judaism. Unfortunately, and I'll get back to this particularly with questions, the Holocaust, to a large extent, disabused us of the notion that we are just citizens of our country who practice Judaism. We might want to think that, we may even believe it and practice it, but much of the rest of the world will not consider it to be accurate. So, a little bit of background also on one other point that may be a little bit surprising. Very often, Judaism is considered as the older brother, in many ways, of Christianity. That we share the same roots, we share much of the same literature, the same texts. You call the Old Testament, we call the Hebrew Bible, same thing. More accurately, we are, as religions, we are siblings of an older tradition that 1900, 2,000 years ago, we both diverged from for different reasons. That the biblical Judaism that is generally known as Judaism, the Judaism of the Hebrew Bible, has not been the Judaism of the Jewish people for going on 2,000 years. And the reason is that religion was intimately associated with institutions in Jerusalem, with the temple, with the priesthood, with a secular organization that surrounded all of that, with a kind of a secular autonomy that Jews had for 1,000 years before then. And in the year 70 CE, I say CE, AD, that all changed. As a part of a Jewish revolt against the Roman rule, the Romans destroyed the temple, and once the temple was gone, there wasn't much left for the priesthood to do, and totally took over the management of the country. Well, Judaism had to change, and over the next 2,000 years, Judaism has become a religion without a temple, without a priesthood. We can get back to that in a bit. But at the same time that was happening, of course, the Gospels were being written. The earliest church fathers were starting to identify the essential points of Christian belief. So there was a century, less than a century, in which the two religions diverged. So, Judaism of today is to a very large extent based on the work of rabbis who worked in that region from perhaps 70 CE, but more accurately about 200 to about 500 in that area in Jerusalem, in the Galilee, and most importantly, surprisingly, in Babylon, which is located real close to present-day Baghdad. So that's my first point, that Judaism is different, and it comes from a very clear historical background. Judaism, like Christianity, is an interpretive religion. We have a group that we call Orthodox. I'll spend a bit more time on that in a little while. But it would be entirely misleading to consider any part of contemporary Judaism as fundamentalist or literalist. All of Judaism is an interpretive religion, interpreting the scriptures, interpreting the holy books. The differences among Jewish groups has to do with the interpretation of those holy books. Now, that's not entirely different from most areas of Christianity. But I just would never use the word fundamentalist to talk about even the strictest of the traditionally observant. They are an interpretive religion. They look at Scripture. They look at one of our very holy books is the Talmud. Can talk about that if anybody would like to later. The interpretations that have been written century after century, building on prior interpretations, building on prior knowledge, that's what goes into all Judaism's, how about that as a word, all Judaisms today, because there are multiple ways of being Jewish in the United States and in the world at large. Judaism has lived, the Jewish people have lived in a variety of environments all over the world, and each of those has fundamentally affected how we practice Judaism. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, there were two main centers of Jewish life. One was in the Iberian Peninsula, mostly Spain. Jews had been in Spain since 700 CE. They, maybe surprisingly, they followed Muslim conquest. Jews living in the heart of the Muslim world, whether Arabia, present-day Iraq, Egypt, Jews have lived there since the beginning of Islam. They, as well as Christians, were considered to be second-class citizens, but as citizens, with rights, with responsibilities, a few more taxes, things like that. But Jews worked very well under Islam for the most part. Simultaneously, a very different group was becoming important in Northern Europe. And they created their own traditions, their own interpretations of the text. The Jews of the time moved into Italy, into Northern Europe, and then over the centuries into Eastern Europe, and they created their own way of being Jewish. Jews under Christianity were less well tolerated, shall we say, than Jews under Islam for the most part. Exceptions, you can find this community here, that community there, which are exceptions, but for the most part, Jews were less well tolerated under medieval Christianity. Come the Enlightenment, everything changed for a lot of people, not so much for Jews. A small group of Jews in the 19th century in Germany, in Hamburg in particular, looked at their neighbors. Mostly northern Germany meant they were mostly Protestant, often Lutheran, and looked at the form of worship, looked at the beautiful churches, looked at this wonderfully distinguished minister in his gorgeous robes, who gave these enlightened sermons, where the congregation was together. They sang beautiful music, they sang hymns, and they looked at their own form of worship, which tended to be fairly chaotic, where the rabbi spent at least half the time sort of mumbling to himself and everybody else mumbling along, because they all knew the prayer book since they were kids. There were no sermons. Some may consider that, But the people many of the people wanted sermons. That was the symbol of enlightened religion. So a new form of Judaism was created, and this is really new. In the 19th century, it was called Reform. Not Reformed, Reform Judaism. It was German. They created their own prayer books. They created their own laws. They got rid of some of the traditional Jewish laws. And it was very successful in northern Germany. Of course, anything like that, not just in the Jewish world, but I mean, you had a Reformation, you got a Counter-Reformation. Within the Jewish world, you had the Reform, and then you had a group of people who said, this is not Judaism, this is not kosher. Literally. And they created a more modern form of traditional Judaism called Orthodoxy. The word Orthodox Judaism was not known until mid-19th century German. Before that, it was just Judaism. And then, of course, you got Orthodox, you got Reform, you need something in the middle for the people who can't make up their minds, and that's Conservative Judaism, which is where I come from. The 9th now let me get to the United States and Judaism in the United States, because Judaism in the United States grew in the 19th century through immigration. Like everything else in the United States, the people who came over were immigrants, and Jews came with the German immigrants in the mid-19th century. They came with Eastern European immigrants in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And of course, each group brings its own brand of Judaism with them. So the earliest, I don't want to say earliest, the earliest Jews arrived in Manhattan, of course, in 1654. They had a Spanish background, and they were on board a ship that was leaving Brazil and going to Amsterdam, and it got thrown off course and ended up in New York. And that was the beginning of Jews in the United States. And because they were from the Spanish background, they didn't bring bagels, they didn't bring... But they were, through the colonial period, through the revolutionary period, Jews were a very, very small fraction of the population. It didn't become noticeable until the German immigration, where a number of German Jews came along with other German immigrants. And because they came from Germany, they were mostly Reform Jews. So the first major institution of Jews in the United States was Reform. And that's important because Reform Judaism tends to be fairly non-dogmatic. It is it is a kind of Judaism that looks at personal autonomy as a major aspect of who you are. So the Jewish commandments, the Jewish laws that had sustained the Jewish world for 1,800 years at that point, were modified. So, in fact, they were modified in major ways. Not just, as I said, the form of worship, having a rabbi in robes in front of a congregation as opposed to the way it had been done, but the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, keeping kosher, that changes. What you can and cannot do on the Sabbath, that changes. In fact, there was one group of Reformed Jews in the United States who even changed the date of the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. It didn't stick. But to a large extent, the dominant form of Judaism, of practice in the 19th century, was Reform. And then the immigration from East Europe of the late 19th century, to a large extent as refugees of political persecution. They came from areas that were, I call it Eastern Europe. At the time, they were almost all Russian, but they were parts of Russia that had been Polish, parts of Russia that had been Ukrainian. There was a whole area between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea where Jews had been settling for 400 or 500 years. That's where the persecutions really became fairly substantial in the 19th century, and Jews at that time basically had a couple of choices. Many of them became secular and political, and you may know the story that many of the early revolutionaries in Russia were Jewish. Many decided to immigrate. If you're going to immigrate, where are you going to go? The majority went to the United States. We had open borders at the time. The only barriers to immigration were health and basically good character. If you were healthy and nobody knew anything bad about you, come on in. I won't spend much time on that, but the point is that they were typically far more traditionally oriented. They were Orthodox. Some were conservative, but they were substantially Orthodox. And when they came over in the millions, they brought their Orthodoxy with them. And the conservative movement came along as a way of, again, helping those Jews who were Orthodox deal with American life. Very important point about being Jewish in America. We talk about freedom of religion, right? It's very important. We have the First Amendment. That is not just to let you be religious or not. It is, for the Jewish world, it lets you be any kind of a Jew you want to be. If you were a Jew in Europe, your Jewish community was essentially a state-sanctioned organization, community. You often had a chief rabbi. Your civil law, and Jewish civil law is very extensive, your civil law was your law. And if you wanted to do something else, you were not able to just go down the street and set up a competing synagogue. You literally couldn't do that. The state would be brought in to prevent you from doing that because your synagogue, your community, was the Jewish community in that area. United States? Not a chance. You didn't like what the rabbi who came over from Minsk was saying? Well, maybe you couldn't even understand him because he hadn't learned English yet. You go down the street and you form your own synagogue, and nobody can stop you. Freedom of religion in the United States meant something very special to Jews of the 19th century. It meant they could be Jewish any way they wanted, and diversity flourished. Diversity in practice, diversity in culture, diversity in the way they could be assimilated. And Jews did really quite well with that diversity. I could go on. I won't. We only have a limited amount of time. So let me talk a little bit more about this diversity. Again, we have Reform Jews. Let me just give you a few highlights of what it means to be Reformed in the United States. Again, it was the original Enlightenment response to traditional Judaism. It was the response of people who were looking around their society and seeing all sorts of modern worlds and say, our religion doesn't look that good. It is self-consciously modernist. It is very comfortable being a modernist, socially adaptable community. There are many Jewish laws that look totally irrational from that perspective. Laws that require the dietary prohibitions. Why? Oh yeah, you could come up with some health reasons for why it's probably not a good idea to eat pork or shellfish, because it can be unhealthy if not properly prepared. But you know, people knew how to prepare pork and shellfish for thousands of years without getting sick. That may or may not be the case, but that was never the basis. God says, don't eat pork. You can ask why all you want, and if God tells you, great. But for the most part, God is not going to tell you those things. It's written in the Bible, it's interpreted in the Talmud, it's reinterpreted over and over in the Jewish interpretive texts, and that's the way it is. Except it's still, why? The question is there. And Reformed Jews said, you know, we don't have to do those things if we can't understand them in a rational, contemporary, enlightened way. Again, the Sabbath observance, very important in traditional Judaism, but totally remodeled in the Reform world. It became the model of high class as a social construct, Jewish practice. The better off Jews in New York City, in Cincinnati, in Chicago, and eventually in Los Angeles were all Reform Jews. It became the right way to be Jewish. When Jews couldn't get into Christian country clubs, Jews created their own country clubs. Reform Jews created their own country clubs. When Jewish doctors couldn't practice at other hospitals, they created their own hospitals. This became the right way to be Jewish. Very important. Interestingly, With the Holocaust as a background, and I'll answer questions about that, but with the Holocaust as a background, Reformed Jewish leaders have in the last 2 generations gone back to basics. They've readapted, brought back to their lives many of the traditional Jewish practices, but without the mandatory part. They will teach traditional Jewish practice and say, here's what it does for you, here's why it's good, your choice. Do you want to do it? Do you not want to do it? Very important point, though. Reformed Judaism was on the forefront of gender egalitarianism. There were only male rabbis, with minuscule exceptions. There were only male rabbis until the 1970s, when a Jewish woman was accepted to the seminary and graduated and ordained. Now there are more than 50%, and I understand this is also true in some parts of the Christian world, more than 50% of the members of the Reform and Conservative world, the rabbis in training in the seminary are women. They have been on the forefront of other social issues. They've been on the forefront of making environmentalism a religious issue, making how you eat, your diet, as a religious ethical issue, and their ideas have spread throughout Judaism. Orthodox Judaism as a response. There is more diversity in the Orthodox world than there is in any other part of Judaism, of the Jewish world. There are modern Orthodox, there are centrist Orthodox, there are ultra-Orthodox, there are Hasidic Orthodox, there are non-Hasidic, there are anti-Hasidic Orthodox. Orthodox congregations have a basic understanding of what Jewish law, the Hebrew word is halakha, you may have heard that, what Jewish law requires. But how you implement that in detail, great amount of diversity. A basic point of most American Orthodox Jews is that Jews can be modern in society without abandoning traditional observance. And it's been pretty successful. The interesting thing is, after the Holocaust, where so much of traditional Jewry, Orthodox Jewry, was killed, Orthodoxy was seen as on its last legs. In the United States, a number of the remnants of the East European communities came here after the war and reestablished themselves. And while nobody was looking, they became the most vibrant, the most fat, the quickest growing part of Judaism. So today, Orthodox Judaism exists, it's growing, it's dynamic, it exists in places where you would never think to look for it. Certain modern Orthodox Jews, as they call themselves, centrist Orthodox Jews, another phrase, you could walk down the street and not look at them and say they're any different from anybody else. And then again, there's the ultra-Orthodox, very often a Hasidic group, and I can answer any questions about that if you'd like. But they're the ones who continue to wear old-style clothing. They're the ones with a variety of different hats. The men tend to wear long black coats. The women tend to be super modestly dressed. Why do they dress this way, you might ask? Because for them, their religion, I don't want to put it quite that boldly, but their way of being Jewish, in many cases, came out of 18th century East European practice. And they too wanted to look like their society. So a chassid of one particular group will wear big furry hats, because that was what the Polish nobility of that era wore. They wore long black coats with belts around, very clear big belts around the middle, because that's what the Lithuanian bourgeoisie wore. They're a minority of even the Orthodox. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about how ethnicity is central and important to understanding Jewishness.
Right.
How, or are there people who convert to Judaism who are not ethnically Jewish? And how is that received? And about what population, what percentage is represented by people who are not ethnically Jewish?
Great question. Yes, conversion has always been possible and has always been discouraged. There's lots of reasons for that. Some practical, some theological.
Yes.
One is that anybody in medieval Europe, anybody who chose to convert from Christianity to Jewish, was probably crazy, and you didn't want to encourage that. But there's more to it than that. There are many obligations that in the traditional form of Judaism you have to accept. And not everybody who starts that path is going to continue it. And the rabbis who are in charge of conversion are very careful about doing that. You want to make sure that people are coming in for the right reasons. Does anybody remember the Seinfeld episode where the dentist, a dentist converts to Judaism? Why? So that he can tell Jewish jokes without being a bigot. There are bad reasons and good reasons for being Jewish. Small minority, but these days where you can be converted by a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi in addition to an Orthodox rabbi, it is not nearly as long and difficult a process, although there is still a process of study before you join. Now, your basic question is, what does it mean to be a convert when there is this strong ethnic component? And the answer is, Jews have always mixed their DNA with the communities in which they live. Is that a delicate way of putting it? The idea is that everybody understands that Jewish ethnicity is a blend, and that for anybody to decide to join, well, there's even a reasonable chance that they had some Jews in their bloodline anyway, but the point is that that's not important. The norm is, once you have converted and been accepted, there is nothing that you are excluded from as a Jew. Period. End of discussion. Except it doesn't really work that way, because there are, communities have their social boundaries, and a sociologist can tell you exactly why this isn't going to work well. But the norm is still very strongly converts, once they've decided to go through that process, are welcome.
You become a Jew by being born of a Jewish mother. That's how you become a Jew, or converted.
Almost.
What else?
One of the things that the Reformed movement did in the 1970s to break away from traditional is they changed that definition.
Okay.
Conservatives still hold to that definition. But for a Reformed Jew or a Reconstructionist Jew, if you decide to, if you are born of a Jewish father and not a Jewish mother, but you are living a Jewish life, you are having a Jewish family, you don't need to convert. You are considered to be a Jew by dint of how you live your life. And since Reformed Judaism is numerically the largest part of Judaism, it has created problems, because now, who is a Jew becomes a really tricky question. So if an Orthodox Jew wants to marry a person of a Reformed background, all of a sudden you have to go to Google and do some genealogical research. And this is a problem for many, but that's the basic point. As I said at the beginning, around the year 200 or so, Judaism was in a real quandary. It couldn't be traditionally Jewish with the temple and the priests, and it had to figure out what it meant to be Jewish in this new world. And there were many oral traditions going back hundreds of years about what it meant to be Jewish. And under challenges from Rome, under challenges from the New Christians, under challenges in the Baghdad area, it wasn't Baghdad, Babylon area, it seemed like a good idea to start writing down some of these traditions so they were uniform. And that was the origin of it. In the year 200, 215, that range, the basic elements of Jewish interpretation of Scripture, particularly how they involved living your life as opposed to theology, were written down in a book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the core of the Talmud. For the next 300 years, rabbis argued about what that meant. But very much like in the Supreme Court, where you record the minority decision as well as the majority decision, in the Talmud, the full debates are recorded. This rabbi says this rabbi says this. The law is with that rabbi. But his words are still recorded and they're still important. There's a phrase that is from the Talmud that applies to all of our lives is, if a dispute is for the sake of heaven, both sides are for the sake of heaven, even if the law comes out on one side. Now, what does it mean for the sake of heaven? That's broadly interpreted. If it is for a good purpose, if you're having a dispute within your religious community, in the civil community, if you're having a dispute, and it's for good reason, one can talk about immigration as a legitimate thing to have a really good discussion about. There are multiple values at play. However it comes out, as long as people are arguing it the right way, it's for the sake of heaven, however it comes out. So that is from the Talmud, and that governs how the Talmud developed. By the year 500, thereabouts, the Talmud as a volume was closed. There have been interpretations since then, and Jewish laws written since then, and changes since then. But what any rabbi in any seminary, in any kind of Judaism does early on is study what's in the Talmud and how do they make their decisions, what are the processes.
Could you, should I ask this?
Yes, go ahead.
Could you comment on first century Jewish apocalypticism, first century Sikh Jewish apocalypticism, and what effect that may or may not have had on the ministry of Jesus in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not an expert in that area. I know a little bit. Before the birth of Jesus, Judaism was in a very interesting place. It was focused in what's today the land of Israel. But there was enough political and economic turmoil going on that many, many Jews were wondering whether this was close to the end of days that had been written about in the Jewish books, the book of Daniel, for example, where end of days notions were there. Judaism has always, to this day, has a strong tradition of the Messiah. It means something different in Judaism than it does in how Christianity has developed, but the idea of a Messiah coming to earth For a Jew, it's a human being, not in any way divine, but who appears on earth and brings peace and brings justice, is very desirable.